So for those of you who are just joining, welcome. Thank you all for joining us on this Saturday morning. My name is Chelsea Miller. I'm the Communications Director at the New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault, also called NYSCASA. Today I'm joined by staff from NYSCASA, as well as In Our Own Voices. For some housekeeping, I will be monitoring the chat for any tech problems, and I will also field questions later this morning. For those who are joining from the media, please hold your questions until the end. When it's time to ask questions, you can either enter questions into the chat box for me to read out loud, or you can use the raise hand feature to ask your question live. In the chat box, I've included a link to our press kit, which has some background information about our organizations, statements we've released this week, and a few opinion pieces that may be useful for you. We are recording this event, and we will distribute the recording this afternoon. We're also streaming live on Facebook. With housekeeping out of the way, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Joanne Zanoni, who's the Executive Director at NYSCASA. Joanne, take it away.
Thank you very much, Chelsea. Thank you very much, Chelsea. Good morning, everyone. As an organization dedicated to ending sexual violence, the New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault is committed to ending oppression in all of its forms, including racism, white supremacy, and state-sanctioned violence. NYSCASA stands in solidarity with calls for justice and accountability for the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others whose lives have been lost to acts of violence fueled by anti-Black racism. We commit to actively working toward dismantling systems that perpetuate violence against Black communities of color. We acknowledge that these systems far too often impact many of the survivors and advocates whom we serve. We also acknowledge that anti-Blackness in our field has prevented many survivors from seeking support. We commit to challenging policies and practices that reinforce white supremacy within our organization and the broader movement to end sexual violence. We also commit to supporting responses to sexual violence that don't uphold white supremacy and contribute to mass criminalization and mass incarceration. We commit to supporting accountability mechanisms that hold people who do harm accountable without targeting and ravaging vulnerable communities. And we call on our colleagues and peers to make this commitment. We acknowledge that justice and accountability may look different for each affected individual, family, and community. We also commit to collaborating with partners and allies to deepen our understanding of state violence and white supremacy, and to develop strategies in partnership with communities of color to build a world without violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. And now I am honored to introduce our next speaker, Tandra Lagrone from In Our Own Voices.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. In Our Own Voices is the only organization in upstate New York whose mission is to work for and ensure the physical, mental, spiritual, political, cultural, economic survival and growth of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people of color communities here in upstate New York. In Our Own Voices seeks to develop the leadership of LGBT people of color, strengthening the voices of LGBT people of color in order to effectively communicate our perspectives within the larger community and increase the capacity for combating oppression and marginalization. In Our Own Voices stands in solidarity with the Black Lives Movement and the protesters as they voice the systematic racism that is embedded in our culture and the many human atrocities against our community, including George Floyd and the many others, Tony Day, Breonna. There are so many. And as a Black lesbian woman, I know too well the inequities, the microaggressions, and the violence that our community face. Today and every day, in our own voices, call for the repeal of 50A law. We call for comprehensive cultural relevancy training for all law enforcements, not a half an hour, not a 15-minute. We're talking about comprehensive training for law enforcement. We call for increased funding for Black-led and trans-led organizations so we can continue to do our work to combat oppression and marginalization. Lastly, we call for the anti-violence movement to work with and add to their agenda Black and brown, transgender, and Black voices and led organizations to center their voices at the table, not as an afterthought, and to immediately add those voices to their agenda today. Thank you on behalf of the Board of Directors of In Our Own Voices and myself, Tandra Lagrone, the CEO, and our staff. We thank you for having us today. And we say to all of the protesters out there, we stand with you.
Thank you. Thank you for saying their names. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for the important reminders. I will now introduce our next speaker, Chris Ballerano, Senior Director of Collaboration and Training at NYSCASA.
Good morning, everyone. As a survivor and a lifelong advocate, I'm honored to share NYSCASA's statement on policing in the Capital Region during protests for racial justice. The New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault, NYSCASA, condemns the violence perpetuated by state and local law enforcement in the city of Albany, our home, over the past week. NYSCASA is committed to ending oppression in all of its forms, including racist and state-sanctioned violence. As experts on trauma, we are concerned about how decisions made by local and state law enforcement, as well as upcoming elections, will continue to traumatize our communities in Albany and across the state. We call on our local and state leadership to commit to the following. Stop using excessive force against protesters and stop poisoning our communities with chemical weapons such as tear gas. Instead, require the widespread use of de-escalation tactics to prevent harm. If officers are not trained in de-escalation techniques, train them. If officers still choose to escalate, fire them. Increase consequences and liability for officers who engage in violence and misconduct. Acknowledge the historical trauma behind the grief and anger that our communities are expressing, and take action to prevent further traumatizing people who have experienced the trauma of anti-Blackness and white supremacy. Refrain from using language that distinguishes between nonviolent and violent protests. This only serves to divide and villainize our communities, especially Black communities of color, when we must stand together in the face of anti-Black racist violence. Respond to protests and grievances with policy and structural change, not with increased policing and surveillance. Shift resources away from law enforcement and toward non-police interventions that promote accountability and safe, healthy communities. Reduce the size of the police force and spending on militarization. Instead, invest in the healthcare, housing, education, and other resources our communities need and that increase safety and prevent violence. Our staff were firsthand witnesses to intensified policing and surveillance in primarily Black communities. Individuals living in these neighborhoods were held to vague curfews, threatened with violence from law enforcement, and overall had their inalienable civil rights dismissed. We also witnessed the presence of a heavily armed, militarized police force, escalating otherwise peaceful situations. We also witnessed the use of excessive force in situations where de-escalation tactics would have been effective and should have been used. The indiscriminate use of non-lethal weapons is harmful. Rubber bullets can result in severe injuries such as bone fractures and injuries to internal organs, and in some cases, death. In addition, it is unconscionable to use a chemical weapon that causes severe respiratory distress against civilians, as we are all challenged by a fatal respiratory illness in the form of COVID-19.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chris. And
Thank you.
now we're at a point where we can take questions, unless Joanne and Tandra have anything to add. I'll give you the floor first.
I think it's a good time for questions, Chelsea. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So first we'll take questions from any members of the media who are here. You can either ask your question live or text in the group chat, or you can raise your hand. If you navigate to participants, find your name, you can use the raise your hand function. If you're here by phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9. And we'll open for questions. Okay. I'm not seeing any raised hands, so I'll open the floor to any community members who would like to ask questions. Again, you can either type it directly in the chat or raise your hand. I am not getting any questions. So let's check Facebook. If you're watching on Facebook and have questions, you can ask your question in the comments. Okay, I'm not seeing questions there. So let's see. Thank you, Jean. We have a question regarding increasing levels of domestic violence and sexual assault. How can we address this without going to the police? That's an excellent question.
One of the things that we have been working with the governor's office, the governor's office is to find alternative ways and to revamp what is needed for victims, such as needing a police report or needing an order of protection to receive services. We're thinking of alternative ways. I sit on that task force, alternative ways to hold batterers or individuals who do harm, using the community for accountability. So I think that we need to rely on the community, and we also need to rely on the voices of survivors and or victims or folks who are experiencing at the hands of the harm doers, or what they would like to do. What is their course of action that they would like to take? But I think we need to, I agree, we need to come up with alternative ways of how we are going to address the violence within our community without necessarily involving law enforcement, especially for our Black and brown individuals. Just the mere fact that of calling the police is in itself not safe. And so we at In Our Own Voices, we will, we have our the Capital Region Anti-Violence Project, and we work with individuals of how to come up with plans to be able to keep themselves safe, their children safe, their household safe, and alternative ways. So I'm hoping, Jean, that answered your question, but it also needs to come from policy, that there is not sheltering first is not the answer for a lot of communities. We need to find alternative housing and alternative ways of not just pushing shelter first, but looking at restorative justice that has worked in many other states, and I'll apply them in New York State. So that's one of my answers, and I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. And thank you to Lorian for sharing in the chat. The New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence is working with domestic violence programs daily during this pandemic, and they're working very hard to make sure there's information in the community to make sure people are aware that domestic violence and sexual assault programs are open and ready to help with advocacy and support.
And
go ahead.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but I also want to talk about the winter that for LGBT, especially gay men and trans women and trans women of color, but transgender or TGNC community, sheltering is not always safe for us and for them, and that we still receive opposition to sheltering gay men, especially Black gay men or Black and brown gay men. And so that's another level of conversation that has to be shifted in this anti-violence movement. We started this movement off with centering the lives of women, but we also know in 2013, under the Obama administration, that was shifted. And a lot of organizations, anti-violence organizations, are struggling to shift not only their policies to meet that, but they're also struggling to shift their way of how they're delivering services. And we, In Our Voices, when we tried to find sheltering for gay men or trans women or trans men or gender non-conforming individuals, it's very difficult. And often they are isolated and re-victimized sometimes, not all the time, within the shelter system. So I just want to add that as well.
Thank you, Tandra. That's really important to remember. I will also add that in the realm of sexual assault, about 2/3 of sexual assaults are never reported to law enforcement. So many people are not calling the police or reporting to law enforcement to begin with, and they have various reasons for not doing so. And in the realm of domestic violence, the reality too is it's underreported, and people are not relying on law enforcement in large numbers for these issues.
It's not safe.
Right.
It's not safe for a lot of people. It's not safe for a lot of people. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut someone.
No, that's absolutely right. There's been a lot of research about this, and sexual assault victims often do not report to police for a wide range of reasons that come down to it is not safe for them to report. Those who do move forward with reporting to law enforcement frequently drop out of the process because it is they're just treated so terribly. They're re-victimized, and so we already know that hardly anybody who has caused sexual harm, committed a sexual crime, ends up in prison. We know that the criminal legal system does not work for sexual assault victims. And that's one of the reasons that NYSCASA has been exploring restorative justice and transformative justice as other options that should be available to those who are looking for accountability, justice, and even more importantly, healing.
That's a great point, Joanne. I would like, is it possible for you to explain and let individuals that may not know when you talk about restorative justice versus transformative justice and the difference between the two?
I will try, and I also invite Chelsea and Chris to chime in, because I know that you have spoken about this probably far more eloquently than I can do justice right now. Really, right now our criminal legal system is about accountability through punishment, and we're taking a look at other forms of accountability that support healing of all involved. So the individuals, the victim, survivor, the harm doer, and the community as a whole. And as you mentioned earlier, Tandra, the community really needs to be a active part of that accountability for whoever has caused harm. So yeah, we're looking at those different options, those different approaches now, and that was a huge focus of the conference that we had hoped to offer just this week, is transformative justice focus.
Thank you, Joanne. And I will add to that the goal of restorative justice processes is to identify who is responsible for harm, who has been harmed, and what they need, and how that harm can be addressed in ways that are holistic and address the survivors' both immediate needs and their long-term needs.
Mm-hmm.
In the case of transformative justice, that is a political framework or an approach that uses a number of different tactics and strategies to first make sure that harm does not occur again and to address the harm that has happened. And it is also important to note that that stems from an abolitionist framework.
Mm-hmm.
So it does not ever rely on state intervention. What it does do is it relies on community members, so family, friends, just people in the community. And thank you. If anyone has anything to add, that would be great. We also have another question.
And thank you, Joanne. I wasn't trying to put you on the spot there. I just wanted to make sure that we're using language that that whomever is watching have a clear understanding of the language that we're using. So thank you.
I really appreciate you bringing it up, especially in light of the fact, like Joanne said, that this was the week of our conference where we were going to get to really discuss these issues in more depth with the communities that we work with. I did want to add regarding shelters that we, the issues you raised, Tandra, and others have spoken to, that we get calls frequently from sexual assault survivors who cannot access sheltering because they're not technically domestic violence victims. There are no shelters in this state specifically for sexual assault survivors who have not been victimized within a domestic violence context. So that's another area where I've gotten calls from trans folks and other folks who are not able to access supports through the traditional domestic violence shelter options for the fact that they're not explicitly living with the abuser, but they're still under threat of attack by that person. And it's really heartbreaking when I have to refer them to Vermont or to churches or some other entity that I have no real clue whether they're going to get what they need. We need to build up that kind of resource here in New York.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. We have a question about de-escalation and if we can share some suggestions for law enforcement in particular, de-escalating situations. And I can start first with saying that we have seen situations where law enforcement do not escalate a situation. We've seen in recent protests and rallies to open New York, for example, that law enforcement have acted with restraint and without riot gear. We have seen that when law enforcement show up to a protest already dressed in riot gear, they have already escalated the situation. They've come dressed for conflict. I have more thoughts, but would love to turn it over to Tandra, Joanne, or Chris.
Actually, I would like to hear your other thoughts, if that's okay.
Sure. So in terms of actual techniques to de-escalate situations, what we first need is open communication. What we witnessed in Albany over the last week in particular is there was no communication. We saw law enforcement indiscriminately spraying tear gas at crowds or at individuals. We saw a lack of communication from leadership in Albany about a vague curfew that didn't seem to exist. We've also seen in broader situations, or situations across the country, where a conversation could go a long way. And I'm also getting a few messages that are very helpful. We've also seen that, and in particular, I guess in Albany this week, we had an example of 1 or 2 people who threw fireworks, and law enforcement responded by tear gassing everyone. That's a situation where they did not need to react as quickly. Our fireworks here are not as dangerous as elsewhere, and those actions did not represent the group as a whole. And I'll stop there for now.
I think a lot of the points that you bring up of the pre-ready of, even with, I understand that people want to protect their livelihoods and businesses are boarding up and but even beyond that, I think Sienna just came out with a report and it asks the community if white people are treated differently by law enforcement. And 65% of those responded yes. Well, as Black and brown people, we already know that, one. Well, we've lived it and we have experienced it. As my cousin Sean Johnson just told me the other day, and I'm mentioning his name because I think it's important that we name folks that are experiencing injustices as well, if we can, and it is safe to do that. Sometimes it's not safe to do that, so I want to be clear that he was almost George Floyd a couple of times, and there are many Black and brown men that were almost George, and Aubrey, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McGade, and other trans. But I think for me, it's deeper than how they're all showing up. If their mentality in the beginning is that coming from a white supremacist place and embedded in blatant racism, that when they show up, whether they show up in riot gear or not, that there is already a heightened perception of how Black and brown and the anti-Blackness that goes along with that, that is already presented. And so I also have seen officers that have joined and have knelt and joined protesters. And I would like to say, what makes that any different than the other folks that, with the couple that just recently in Albany, that it escalated way out of control, because in my opinion, you had some untrained officers that were able to exert their power in an inappropriate way versus having the ability to see individuals as human beings and being able to have conversations. And it escalated a situation that could have just been really, in my opinion, that could have been resolved very easily. I think I also read where when someone stated that that there are law enforcement that attach their manhood to their badge and that power that carries, and when you threaten that, it's easily escalated, and people are harmed and get hurt. So yes, the tear gas, I agree with everything that you just said, but I also want to dive deeper into and calling it what it is, which is racism and how people are viewed and how Black and brown people are viewed in America and throughout the world. Mm-hmm. So it's just not locally. This is a historical 401 and beyond year issue. So I just want to add that as well.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
I'm thinking I should share some things that Sarah has shared in the chat with me. I would like to thank you though for those comments, Tandra, and just in terms of the question around police behavior and how we can encourage a de-escalation rather than what we've been seeing around the racist response of escalation. Experts say that following decades of research, they've turned up similar findings. Escalating force just leads to more violence, not less. It tends to create groups where protesters escalate against police. Police escalate even further, and both sides become increasingly angry and afraid. And we know that there are de-escalation strategies that exist. And Nasser, a professor of sociology at Freie University in Berlin, has studied how the Berlin Police Department handles protests and soccer matches. She found one key element is transparent communication. Something she said, helps to build trust, helps to increase trust and diffuse potentially tense moments. The Berlin police employs people specifically to make announcements in these situations. Different speakers with local accents or different languages for things like information about what police are doing, and another speaker for commands. Either way, the messages are delivered in a calm and measured voice. Sarah also shared that communication is also a cornerstone of what police in the United States know as the Madison Model, created by former Madison, Wisconsin Chief of Police David Cooper. His strategy for dealing with protesters was to send officers out to talk with demonstrators, engage with them, ask them why protests were being made, listen to their concerns, and above all, empathize. I hear you though. I hear you saying, that that racism can trump all that, and it can negate these efforts. But I really feel like we need people like this individual to not allow for racism to be the motivating force in how behavior is carried out, and racism just can't be tolerated. That's like the way we've seen it getting called out in recent weeks. I think we need to keep that pressure on. That's just my 2 cents at the end there, but the rest of those comments were from Sarah.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Sarah, as well. So we're talking a lot about de-escalation. In our statements, we've talked about requiring de-escalation techniques be used. This requires training. We've also called for training
There you go.
in culturally specific or culturally appropriate ways. We've talked about understanding trauma and the ways that people who have experienced trauma are responding to increasingly traumatic situations, which in interacting with law enforcement is traumatic for many people, particularly Black and brown people of color.
And the importance of repeal of 50A.
Would you be able to speak more on that, Tandra?
Well, it's 50A is that we have access to the disciplinary actions that and the history, the personnel files of police officers that that is made public, and we're able to access it. So we're able. It's just, you know, one of the things that I love the most, I think I just read or saw recently, is that when we are pulled over with just a click of a button, you know, law enforcement knows our whole and complete history in a matter of 4 or 5 seconds. We should be able to have access to their history as well. We should know that if someone has had disciplinary issues, especially related to specific issues around aggressiveness, force, and any disciplinary action, we should, as the public and as America, we should know that information. We should know who we're dealing with. We should know who's on the force and how is that impacting their daily decision making across the board. I also want to agree with, I'm sorry, I gotta take my glasses off to read this, Chris. I agree with you around the de-escalation techniques, but training is one part of that. And that when you're just getting an X amount of training, I think, you know, we were in our own voices at one point, we were training all new beat cops and all of the new cops that were coming on board. And we sometimes, you know, we were working with really great systems to be able to train on cultural relevancy training. But it's an hour. And, you know, a quick story is that we've gone in and had that half an hour, and we walk away, and then we'll get a text from some attendant participant that is in the training saying that, you know, the commander said, okay, well, now we got the gay stuff out of the way, let's just move on to something else. So it has to be start from the top down, and that training is needed. And and accountability also needs to be attached to the training. You can have the de-escalation training techniques, but if accountability is not attached to it, then we still are at the same place that we are today.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And as Chris had mentioned earlier, to make sure there are consequences for police officers who do not adhere to the training that they've received, and to shift funding away from militarization towards this training. We know they have the funds. They can use it.
And back to, you know, domestic and sexual assault specific training. And, you know, we're still hearing stories how police officers are showing up, not all, and I keep saying this, that not all, but are showing up to domestic violence incidents with harm doers, especially with LGBT, are trying to determine who is the perpetrator or who is the aggressor, and it gets, or they are not acting to do follow-up because they're saying that, you know, that we've been called to this address 4 or 5 times. enough is enough, so we're just going to arrest both of you. Or that a person is not believed based on their attire or how the victim is being blamed for how they show up or how they are presenting or trying to present their case and let them know what has happened to them. That is, then they are re-victimized, trying to go through that system. And that, when you do, we will say, well, do you have a police report? We read the police report, and then you line that police report up to what that person just experienced. And there's two different things that is being recorded. Body cameras are being turned off. We have to think of alternative ways of accountability and putting survivors and victims and people who are experienced at the hands of harm doers, their voices first.
Absolutely. Thank you. And we've got a comment here from, I believe that's E, who wants to remind us too about folks who are incarcerated, particularly survivors who are incarcerated, who do not have access to the same resources as people in the general population, the general public. Within our current system, 90% of incarcerated women who are more likely to be Black women or otherwise women of color are survivors of gender-based violence themselves. And we at NYSCASA work with a lot of incarcerated survivors, and we also want to center their voices as well, where possible. There's a question here. Let me see.
From Jean?
Yes, from Jean. Our children are learning racism, homophobia, and sexism. These police officers who do act in racist, homophobic, and sexist ways, they learned those behaviors. When we return to whatever normal is, what is primary prevention going to be in the long term? How do we change the socialization of our kids? And I think I'm going to call on Sarah, if possible, who is our prevention director at NYSCASA, if you'd be willing to speak on what primary prevention could look like.
Big question. Huge.
Sarah, you are unmuted.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, sorry, I'm having a little trouble with Zoom. I mean, I think, right, long term it is defunding police departments, right? Taking that money and diverting it into prevention programming, which is not just like the prevention programming that our programs and others run for youth around teaching healthy relationships, healthy ways of being in the world, but also the things that we know are also prevention, right? Housing, healthcare, education, funding for community-led, especially Black and Brown community-led organizations, the things that we know create safe and thriving communities. And as far as the people who are already adults, right, the police already in these police departments, it's like Tandra already said, like have the trainings, but there need to be consequences for the trainings, because we've seen APD the Albany Police Department has already been trained, right? And they're still acting like this. So there need to be consequences attached to those trainings.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, one of the interesting things about primary prevention of sexual violence and other forms of violence is that there's this idea that we can train people, we can educate people. There's a lot of emphasis on working at the individual level of things. And what we know is that the sources of the violence is pretty much the source of all the violence, every form of oppression, from racism, sexism, homophobia. Every form of oppression is the root of the violence. And that's why we are focused on addressing sexual violence. But for us to do that, we are also addressing every form of oppression. You know, at the societal level, poverty, every expression of inequality, every expression of a power imbalance, those are the root causes. If there's general acceptance of any form of oppression, it supports violence. So we really need to get our act in order. We have a lot of work to do because we as individuals, our families, our communities, our systems, in so many ways, allow the oppression, the inequality, the inequity, the power imbalances, the power abuses to go on.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, or if one of our speakers has additional thoughts that they would like to share.
Well, I was just thinking about how oppression is, as Joanne pointed out, rooted in power and balance, and the inequities around the economics of the way our country has been built, right? I mean, we have, we can't possibly work that through in the next 10 minutes, but the fact that corporate capitalism is dependent on profits. So these military weapons, this militarization of the police force didn't just happen by accident, right? There are people making a ton of money from that kind of contract, those kinds of contracts. Just like there are people making a ton of money off of wars in other countries, that our country supposedly is there for freedom, and we know that there's like a whole lot of business interest involved in war, and that's been true for a really long time. And unless we really start to look at corporate capitalism and how that impacts our healthcare systems, how that impacts our education system, how that impacts even what we're talking about right now, the way the police are being militarized with weaponry that doesn't make anyone safer, including them. They are cogs in a machine. And I'm not defending anything, but I'm saying that that's a whole nother conversation that needs to be had.
Thank you, Chris.
Also, if I can just add, sorry, Chelsea.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Off guard before. I'm reading Jean's question now about the socialization of our kids, and I think ultimately, like Joanne was getting at too, on one hand, it almost doesn't matter because it's not just how how police officers are socialized as kids, right? It's about the culture of the department. It's about the culture of policing in general that they're entering into. Look at what happened in Buffalo. Was it just yesterday or the day before, where those officers pushed down that elderly man, right, who hit his head on the concrete and began bleeding profusely. And one officer, you could see, had a break almost in his training, right, that he received as police, and went to help the man while the other officer pulled him back. Like, their position and the culture of policing forces them to push down their own humanity, right? So so one child who grows up into an adult who is socialized like with that humanity and is not going to change an entire culture that has been years and centuries in the making when they enter into that institution. So it has to be about changing institutions, and has to be about changing culture, and has to be about, you know, helping communities access the power to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Until we denounce, until white privilege and white supremacy is denounced, and that white privilege and how it's being exercised, and for folks with white privilege to understand their power and how that power impacts Black and brown and and folks that are not at that are at the margins. That's where the work has to begin. That's the theme. We've been saying it over and over. Everything that was just mentioned is rooted in white supremacy.
Yes.
Indeed.
Yes. And on that note, I will also turn to one of the reasons why we're here today. There will be a Troy rally for Black Lives happening on Sunday. And as we speak, the Troy Police Department is preparing a heavily armed militarized response in anticipation of a planned vigil and march, which will be connecting Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, George Floyd, and many others to the racial injustice and tragedy we've witnessed in the Capital Region, including Edson Thevenin, Damique McDonald, Thaddeus Faison, and so many more. We are coming up to the top of the hour. Tandra, Joanne, Chris, do you have any final words to share?
I'm grateful that you supported pulling this together as you did, Chelsea, and that everyone who showed up today showed up. And I really appreciate y'all taking time from this Saturday, during this really busy pandemic period, to give your precious time and attention to our conversation here. And I know as an individual, I will be there on Sunday, and that I am really praying and hoping that our message is heard by those who have the power to do something different on Sunday in regards to responding to the cries for justice and healing.
Thank you, Chris.
For my last words, I would say power to the people.
Thank you, Tandra.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. In closing, we affirm. Oh,
thank you.
Go ahead.
I also want to thank Joanne for pulling this together and doing it so quickly. Thank you, NYSCASA.
Thank you all for joining, for participating, for spending time. And in closing, we'll say that we affirm that Black Lives Matter, period.